The gunshot that announced Stephen Walker's arrival in Alma Crossing came from somewhere behind him on the Cobber Ridge Road, and the second one came closer than the first. Nora Bristol heard both from the seat of her library wagon, where she had just reined in the mules to let a boy run out and fetch his mother's promised almanac. She turned in time to see a rider come around the bend at a dead run, slumped low over his horse's neck, one hand fisted in the mane and the other pressed hard against his ribs. Blood had soaked through his shirt in a dark fan that the wind was already drying into a stain the color of rust. Rider coming in hot. Someone shouted from the porch of Hartman's store, and men who had been leaning against the rail a moment before were suddenly upright, hands finding the rifles they kept close in a border town that had learned, the hard way, to keep them close. The horse did not slow so much as give out. Its front legs buckled 30 feet from the wagon, and the rider pitched forward out of the saddle. Nora was down from her seat and running before she had decided to run. Her skirts gathered in one fist, and she caught him under the arms as he went down the rest of the way, taking his weight against her shoulder so his head did not strike the hard-packed street. "Easy," she said, though he had not asked for easy. "Easy now, I have got you." He was heavier than she expected, and his skin was cold despite the sun, and up close she could see that the wound in his side was not the only mark on him. There was a graze along his temple crusted with dried blood, and his knuckles were split as though he had been in more than one kind of fight to get here. His eyes opened, gray and glassy with pain, and found her face and held there as if she were the only fixed point in a spinning world. "They cut the line," he said. His voice came out cracked, barely more than breath. "Telegraph. Cut it at the ridge. Crane means to." He stopped, coughed, and his whole body flinched at whatever that cost him. "Crane means to what?" Nora asked, low and urgent, her hand pressed flat against the wound to slow the bleeding. "Tell me, who is coming?" "Riders." His eyes were losing their focus now, sliding toward the sky. "Behind me, maybe an hour, don't let them." His hand closed weakly around her wrist. "The wagon, 2 forks, don't let the wagon go through." That was all he gave her before his eyes rolled back and his grip went slack, and Nora Bristol was left kneeling in the street of a border town, with a stranger's blood on her hands and half a warning ringing uselessly in her ears. "Get Doña Refugio," she said to the boy who had frozen by the wagon wheel, and when he did not move fast enough she said it again, sharper. "Now, run." Ezekiel Hartman came off his porch steps with his rifle already in the crook of his arm, gray whiskers bristling, eyes on the ridge road. "Riders behind him," he said. That is what he said. Nora did not look up from the wound. She had torn a strip from her own petticoat without any particular modesty about it, and was pressing it hard against the hole in his side. "Get the men to the north end of the street. If anyone comes asking after him, I want them turned around before they cross the wash." Hartman did not argue with her. Nobody in Alma Crossing much argued with Nora Bristol when her voice took on that flat, forge-tempered edge. Not since she had spent 3 years running her late husband's smithy alone, and had proven, horseshoe by horseshoe and wagon tire by wagon tire, that she did not make promises she could not keep. The riders did come. 40 minutes later, 4 of them, dust-caked, moving at a hard trot along the ridge road until they crested the rise and saw a dozen armed men standing loose and unhurried across the mouth of the street, rifles held with the particular calm of people who did not need to look nervous to be dangerous. The riders slowed. One of them, a broad man in a black hat with a Winchester laid across his saddle bow, studied the town for a long moment, spat into the dust, and turned his horse without a word. The others followed. They did not come down into Alma Crossing that day. By then Doña Refugio had arrived from the mission end of town with her basket of clean linen and her sharp dark eyes, and between the 2 women, they had the stranger carried into the low adobe room behind the smithy that had been Nora's home since Thomas died, laid out on her own bed, and the wound in his side opened, cleaned, and packed with a poultice that smelled of yarrow and whiskey. "He will live," Doña Refugio said finally, wiping her hands on her apron, "if the fever does not take him first. You will need to watch him tonight." "I intend to," Nora said, and did not examine too closely why the words came so readily. She sat beside him through that first night with a lamp turned low and her rifle within reach, listening to the wind pick up outside and rattle the shutters, listening to him breathe in shallow, uneven pulls and turning his half a warning over and over in her mind. "Crane. The wagon. 2 forks. Don't let it go through." She did not yet know what any of it meant, only that a man had ridden himself half to death to say it, and that whatever was coming, it was coming for her town. He did not wake fully until the second morning, when the light came slanting gold through the one small window and found him already watching her, gray eyes clear now, though shadowed with pain. "You are in my house," Nora said before he could ask, "in Alma Crossing. You lost a fair amount of blood, and you have 4 stitches in your side that I am not sorry to say I put in myself, since Doña Refugio's hands are steadier for babies than for men who thrash." She set down the mending in her lap. "You told me your name was going to get lost with the rest of it if you did not spit it out quick. Try again now that you are not dying." A faint, pained smile touched his mouth. "Stephen Walker, Mr. Walker." She studied him the way she might study a piece of iron before deciding how it wanted to be shaped. "You said crane. You said a wagon and 2 forks and that I should not let it go through. That is not much of a warning to leave a woman with." "No," he admitted. "It is not." He tried to push himself up on one elbow and thought better of it with a hiss of breath. "How long was I out?" 2 days, on and off." "Long enough for the men who were chasing you to lose their nerve at the edge of town and turn back toward the ridge." She watched his face carefully. "Long enough for me to wonder who you crossed to get 4 bullet holes and a horse run to death." 3 bullet holes," he said. "One of them just grazed." "That is not the reassurance you seem to think it is." Something in that got a real laugh out of him, short and startled, quickly swallowed as it pulled at his stitches. He looked at her properly then, this woman who had sat up with a stranger through a fevered night, and now sat mending a torn shirt sleeve as though nothing about any of it frightened her, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight since he had ridden out of the hills 2 nights before eased, just slightly. "Sila's Crane owns the Cobber Ridge mine," he said, "and the spur line that runs the ore down to the Southern Pacific Junction at 2 forks. He also owns, one way or another, most everything that comes up that spur the other direction: flour, seed, medicine, mail. Your town's supply wagon has not come through in 3 weeks. That is not bad luck, Mrs. Bristol," she said. "Nora Bristol. Mrs. Bristol. That is Crane, starving Alma Crossing to make your council sign over the water rights on the Santa Rosa Creek, so he can run his stamp mill twice the hours on half the water he is paying for now. I know because I have been keeping his ledgers under the name Stephen Walker for the better part of a year, and because 3 weeks ago I found the order in his own hand telling the depot agent at 2 Forks to hold every wagon bound for this town until your council folded." Nora's needle stilled. "That is a hanging kind of thing to know about a man like Crane." "It is," Stephen agreed. "It is also not the worst of what I know. There is gas in the number 3 shaft that has already killed 2 men this year, and Crane has had the inspection reports rewritten both times. Every miner in that camp owes the company store more than he will ever earn, and Crane likes it that way because a man who owes cannot walk away." He met her eyes. "I tried to take the real ledger out with me. His man Bragg caught me before I cleared the ridge. I do not have it anymore. What I have is what is in my head, and a bullet wound, and about a day's head start that is likely already spent." For a long moment Nora said nothing at all. She thought of Thomas, 3 years dead now, crushed under a winch drum that Crane's own foreman had known was cracked and had ordered used anyway because a new one would have cost 2 days' production. She thought of the shipment that had not come, and the flour bin at Hartman's store that was down to its last third, and the way the whole town had begun, in small, quiet ways nobody wanted to say aloud, to go hungry. "Well, Mr. Walker," she said at last, setting her mending aside and rising to bank the fire. "It seems you and I have got a great deal of work ahead of us, and you are not fit to sit a horse, and I have a library route due at 3 settlements inside the week, whether Sela's Crane likes it or not. I expect we had better start planning how to do both at once." Stephen Walker looked at her, at the steady set of her shoulders, the ink-stained fingers that had been turning book pages for families scattered across 50 miles of borderland before ever they turned to nursing a stranger's wound, and felt something he had not let himself feel in longer than he cared to count. "You are not going to ask if I am dangerous," he said. "I already know you are dangerous," Nora said without turning from the fire. "The question is whether you are dangerous to me, and I have decided I do not think so. Now rest. You will need your strength, and so I expect will I." The days that followed did not allow much room for rest, hers or his. Word of the held wagon spread through Alma, crossing the way word always spread in a small border town, fast and swollen with fear in the telling. Hartman's flour bin dropped lower. The Aguilar family, whose well had gone bitter that spring, began hauling water 2 miles from the creek because they no longer trusted what came from their own ground. And Nora, walking past their dooryard on her way to the smithy, could not help but wonder if that, too, traced back up the ridge to Crane's tailings. She kept the forge lit longer each day. It had been Thomas's forge before it was hers, and for the first year after he died, she had let it sit cold more days than not, unable to stand the ring of the hammer without hearing his voice under it. But a town running short of nails, plow points, and wagon wheel rims does not care for a widow's grief, and somewhere in that first hard winter alone, Nora Bristol had picked the hammer back up because somebody had to, and found, to her own surprise, that she was good at it, better in some ways than Thomas had been, for she had the patience for fine work that he had lacked. Stephen healed faster than Doña Refugio had predicted, though not so fast as he pretended. Within a week he was on his feet, and within 2 he had wandered, restless, out to the smithy, where he found Nora up to her elbows in the ash pit and stood a long while in the doorway watching her work the bellows before he spoke. "You are short-handed," he said. "I can pump a bellows and hold a piece steady even if I cannot swing a hammer yet. Let me earn my keep." She looked at him over the glow of the coals, sweat-damp hair escaping its pins, and something in her chest did a slow, unfamiliar turn. "You are supposed to be resting. I have been resting for 2 weeks in your bed while you feed your whole town out of your own kitchen and forge tools half the night besides. I would rather be useful than guilty, Mrs. Bristol." So he stayed and pumped the bellows and held the tongs when she asked him to, and in the long orange hours between dusk and midnight, while sparks rose and died against the dark, they talked. He told her in pieces about the year he had spent as Crane's ledger clerk, careful never to say much of what had come before that year, and she noticed the careful edges of what he left out and did not press, not yet. She told him about Thomas Steady, laughing Thomas, who had taught her to read a horseshoe's heat by its color before she was 20, and who had died believing to the last that a good man's word still meant something to men like Crane. "It did not," she said, one such night, watching the coals rather than his face. "His word meant nothing at all. I forged the tool that fixed that winch drum with my own hands, after, out of pure spite, because I could not bear the thought of some other family losing a husband to Crane's cheapness. That was the first thing I ever made alone. I have been making things ever since." Stephen was quiet a moment. "I am sorry," he said, and it did not sound like the empty condolence she had heard 100 times before. It sounded like a man who understood, in his own bones, what it cost to watch someone die, because a rich man had decided their life was worth less than his profit. By the 3rd week, with the wagon still not come, and Hartman's shelves nearly bare, the town council met in the back room of the store, 5 men, and at Nora's insistence herself, since she alone among them had heard Crane's scheme laid bare in a fevered man's warning. They argued long into the night about whether to send word to the territorial marshal at Tucson, and could not agree, since the telegraph line remained cut past the ridge and any rider sent would take the better part of a week there and back through country that was not, at present, friendly to riders from Alma Crossing. "I have my route to run regardless," Nora said, when the arguing had worn itself thin. "Two Forks is on it. So is the Aguilar Rancho. And Tomas Javier's people out past Dry Wash. If I am going that way whether the council likes it or not, I might as well be going with my eyes open, looking for whatever proof there is to find, and whatever help there is to ask for." "It is not safe," Hartman said, "not with Bragg's men still riding that country." "It has not been safe for a widow to run a smithy alone either," Nora said, "and I have managed 3 years of that without dying of it." She looked to where Stephen stood near the door, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Mr. Walker knows that ledger, knows Crane's men, and knows the mine better than any of us. If he is willing, I would rather ride with him than without him." "I am willing," Stephen said, before anyone could raise an objection, and something about the quickness of it made Nora's cheeks warm despite the gravity of the room. They set out 2 mornings later, before first light. Nora's library wagon loaded with its usual cargo of books and letters and territorial newspapers, plus a good deal more flour and seed than she usually carried, quietly donated by families who could ill afford to spare it but who understood, in the particular way border folk understood such things, that a favor given freely today was a debt that might save your own children tomorrow. Stephen rode alongside on a borrowed horse, still moving a little stiffly, a rifle across his saddle bow and Thomas Bristol's old revolver, given to him by Nora without ceremony the night before, riding low on his hip. "You are trusting me with a dead man's gun," he had said, turning it over in his hands. "I am trusting you with a great deal more than that," Nora had answered and left it there, and gone to bed before either of them could say anything further about what that meant. The wind found them before Dry Wash Crossing did. It came up out of the southwest in the middle of the morning, first as a low brown smudge along the horizon that Nora mistook, for one hopeful moment, for distant rain. Stephen, who had ridden enough open country to know better, reined his horse in close beside the wagon and pitched his voice to carry over the first gusts. "Windstorm," he said. "A bad one by the look of that wall. We want to find shelter, not try to outrun it." They found the Delgado Rancho less than a mile on, a low adobe house and a scatter of outbuildings hunkered at the base of a hill, and arrived just as the first real force of the wind hit, flattening the mesquite and sending a chicken coop's loose door slamming open and shut like a gunshot. Rosa Delgado met them in the yard with her apron pressed to her face against the flying grit, shouting that her husband and the boys were out trying to bring in the cattle before the herd scattered clear to the border, and that the roof over the grain store had already begun to peel back at one corner. Stephen was off his horse and moving before Nora had fully processed the danger, catching a length of rope from the barn wall and shouting for Rosa to show him the corner that had come loose. Nora tied off the mules, grabbed a hammer and a fistful of nails from her own wagon box, a librarian's wagon. She had long ago decided ought to carry a few practical things besides books, and followed him up the ladder Rosa's youngest boy held steady against the wind. "Hold there," Stephen shouted, wedging his shoulder under the lifted edge of tin roofing while the wind screamed past them, tearing at hair and clothes alike. "Nail it through the batten, not the tin. It will tear through the tin in a season otherwise." Nora, gripping the ladder rail with one hand and swinging the hammer with the other, felt a fierce, unfamiliar thrill under the fear, the particular joy of doing something difficult and doing it well, shoulder to shoulder with a man who trusted her hands as much as his own. Below them, Rosa's husband and sons came pounding into the yard, driving a knot of terrified cattle before them, and Stephen, roof secured, half slid in half, climbed down the ladder to help turn the herd into the corral before the wind could scatter it across 5 miles of open range. It took the better part of 2 hours, in the shrieking brown dark of the storm, to get the last of the cattle penned, and the barn doors braced, and the grain store roof lashed down tight enough to hold. By the time the wind began, gradually, to ease, Nora's hands were raw and blistered from rope and hammer both, and Stephen's shirt was torn at the shoulder where a flying shingle had caught him, and they stood together in the strange gold-brown light that always followed such a storm, breathing hard, grinning at each other like fools. "You are handy in a storm, Mr. Walker," Nora said, pushing grit-heavy hair back from her face. "I have had practice staying ahead of things trying to knock me down," he said, and there was a shadow behind the joke that she noticed, and again, did not press. Rosa Delgado would not let them leave that night, storm-battered as they all were, and fed them beans and fresh tortillas by lamplight while her husband thanked Stephen so many times that the man finally laughed and told him to save his gratitude for whichever saint had sent a stranger riding by at the right hour. It was full dark by the time Nora found herself alone with Stephen on the porch. The wind gentled now to an ordinary night breeze, stars coming clear overhead. "You said you had practiced staying ahead of things trying to knock you down," she said quietly. "I have been waiting 3 weeks for you to tell me what that means, Mr. Walker." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then, "Before I was Stephen Walker keeping Crane's books, I rode with men who took what they wanted at gunpoint. 6 years of it out of Texas and up through the territories. I am not proud of it. I am not going to pretty it up for you. There is a man dead in Val Verde County who should not be dead, a bystander who stepped out of a store at the wrong moment during a job that went wrong, and I have carried that every day since, and I expect I will carry it the rest of my life." He kept his eyes on the dark line of the hills. "I walked away after that, changed my name, because the men I rode with would have killed me for walking, and because I could not stand to hear my own name any more without hearing that shot. I have spent 4 years since trying to be a man worth the second chance nobody gave me but myself. I do not know if that is enough to tell you, or too much." Nora sat with that a long moment, watching the same dark hills. "My husband used to say a man is not the worst thing he has ever done if he spends the rest of his life proving he is more than that." She turned to look at him. "You rode into gunfire to warn a town full of strangers what Crane meant to do to them, Stephen Walker. I have buried a man who did less brave a thing for people he loved his whole life. I am not afraid of who you were. I am rather more interested in who you are choosing to be." He looked at her then, really looked, in the starlight, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence full of something neither was quite ready to name. Then a coyote called somewhere out past the corral, and the moment eased rather than broke, and they said their good nights and went to their separate beds under the Delgado's roof. But Nora lay awake a long while after, listening to the wind, thinking about gray eyes and a voice gone rough with old grief. And Stephen, in the barn loft, took a stub of pencil from his saddlebag and a scrap of paper and wrote, by lantern light, words he had no intention of ever showing her. "I do not know how a man says thank you for being looked at like he is not ruined." Before he folded the paper small and tucked it, almost without thinking, between the pages of the book she had lent him that morning. A worn copy of poems he had been reading a little each night since his fever broke, meaning to return it to her satchel before she noticed. He did not notice himself that he had left it there. They pushed on toward Presidio de la Cruz 2 days later, the storm's damage visible all along the road fence lines flattened, a telegraph pole down, and its wire tangled in the brush like a dead snake, a rancher's roof stripped bare to its rafters. At the Presidio, an old trading post grown up around a mission chapel where American, Mexican, and Tohono O'odham families had traded goods and news for 2 generations, Nora made her usual rounds, delivering a crate of school books to the little adobe schoolroom, a bundle of letters to the Ortiz family whose son wrote faithfully from Sonora, a territorial newspaper 3 weeks stale, but eagerly received by old men who gathered at the well to argue over its contents. It was there in the trading post yard that a broad-shouldered man in a dusty coat straightened up from where he had been leaning against a hitching rail and said, in a voice pitched to carry, "Well, I will be damned. Steve Doyle, large as life. Stephen went very still. You have got the wrong man, he said low. I do not think I do. The man Dutch Meagher, though Nora did not yet know his name, grinned without warmth. Rode with you 3 years under Cal Doyle before you turned yellow and lit out. Heard you had gone respectable somewhere south. Did not figure to find you playing errand boy for a librarian. His eyes flicked to Nora, assessing, and she felt her spine straighten under the look. Crane's put a price on the head of a man matching your description who has been thieving his ledgers. Might be there is money in this yet, one way or another. There is no money in it, Stephen said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in a way Nora had not heard from him before, a voice that belonged perhaps to a man named Steve Doyle. That life is dead, Dutch. I buried it myself. You are welcome to go on to Crane and tell him whatever you like. I am not going to stop you, and I am not going to run from you either. For a long moment the two men stared at each other across the dusty yard, and Nora, watching, understood that something old and dangerous was being decided, and that Stephen was choosing, in front of her, not to become the man Dutch Meagher wanted him to be, even if it cost him. Then Dutch spat in the dirt, shrugged with elaborate carelessness, and swung up onto his horse. Your funeral, he said, and rode out toward the north road, toward Cobber Ridge, toward Crane. Nora let out a breath she had not known she was holding. He is going to tell Crane exactly where to find you. I expect so. Stephen's shoulders were rigid, his jaw tight, but when he turned to her his eyes were steady. I am sorry. I should have told you the whole of it before it came looking for us in a trading post yard. You told me what mattered, Nora said. You told me who you chose to be just now, in front of a man who wanted you to be someone else. That is worth more to me than a name you left behind 4 years ago. She hesitated, then added, quieter, Steve Doyle is not who rode into Alma Crossing half dead to save a town of strangers. I only know Stephen Walker, and I find I am not sorry to know him. Something in his face broke open then, some tightness he had carried since Val Verde County finally easing, and he reached out, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and took her hand. Nora, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the misses in front of it. Whatever comes of this, whatever Crane does when Dutch reaches him, I want you to know that riding with you these past days has been the first time in 4 years I have felt like the man I am trying to be instead of the man I am running from. Nora did not pull her hand away. Then let us go find out what Crane means to do about it, she said, together. They reached Two Forks Siding the following afternoon, the little rail depot where the Cobber Ridge spur met the Southern Pacific Main Line, and found the freight yard crowded with wagons that should long since have rolled south toward Alma Crossing, flour, seed corn, crates of medicine, all of it sitting under canvas in the yard, while the depot agent, a thin, nervous man named Whitfield, refused to release a single wagon without a signed order from the mine office. I have my instructions, Whitfield said, sweating despite the cool afternoon when Nora demanded an explanation. Mr. Crane's man Bragg was through here not 3 days back. Nothing moves south on the spur road until the Alma Crossing Council signs the water agreement. Those are Crane's own words to me. Those wagons are 3 weeks overdue, Nora said. There are children in that town going hungry, Mr. Whitfield, and you know it. I know it, Whitfield said miserably, and I am sorry for it, but I have a family of my own, and Bragg does not make idle threats about a man's employment, nor about worse than that. It was then that Silas Crane himself stepped down from the private car that had, unnoticed by either of them, arrived on a siding not 50 yards away. A spare, silver-haired man in an expensive gray suit that looked entirely wrong against the dust of a border rail yard, flanked by the broad, black-hatted figure of Bragg, whom Nora recognized at once as the man who had led the riders away from Alma Crossing 3 weeks before. Mrs. Bristol, Crane said, with a small, cold smile, as though they were meeting at a church social. And Mr. Doyle, I believe, though I understand you have been going by Walker of late. Dutch Meagher proved a useful informant. I confess I did not expect to find the two of you conveniently delivered to my own depot. You have been starving a town to steal their water, Crane, Nora said, and did not soften her voice for his fine suit. You have poisoned their wells with your tailings and killed men in your mine with rotten timber and worse air, and covered it with false reports. I mean to see every wagon in this yard on the road south by nightfall, and I mean to see you answer for the rest of it in front of a territorial judge. Crane's smile did not waver. A librarian and a wanted outlaw threatening me with a judge. How delightfully theatrical. I own the only working telegraph line for 40 miles, Mrs. Bristol, and the only rail spur, and very shortly, one way or another, I will own the water your little town depends on to exist at all. There is no judge coming to Two Forks today. There does not need to be, Stephen said quietly, for Bragg to hang for what he did to the man he shot in the number 3 shaft last spring and buried under a rockfall report. I saw the real inspection, Crane. I copied it before I left, and I have it memorized well enough to swear to it in any court in the territory, with or without your ledger. For the first time, something flickered behind Crane's composure, not fear exactly, but calculation, the look of a man recounting his cards. Bragg, he said, without looking away from Stephen, escort our former clerk off my property. Bragg's hand moved toward his gun, and half a dozen things happened very quickly. Stephen stepped between Bragg and Nora without seeming to think about it at all, his own hand steady on the grip of Thomas Bristol's revolver, though he did not draw it. Whitfield the agent backed hastily into his depot office, and Nora, refusing to be shielded, stepped up beside Stephen rather than behind him, chin lifted, and said, loud enough for the handful of yard hands and freight men within earshot to hear clearly. Every man in this yard heard Silas Crane say he means to take the water that 100 families in Alma Crossing depend on to live. I am a territorial librarian, Mr. Crane, and it is my sworn duty to carry news wherever I travel. You may be certain that every family on my route, and every one of the newspapers I deliver to, will hear exactly what has been said here today. Bragg's hand had not moved from his gun, but it had not drawn it either, and in the sudden charged stillness a new voice spoke up from the edge of the yard, one of the mine's own teamsters, a weathered man named Pedro Ibarra, who had been loading crates onto a wagon and had gone quite still at Nora's words. It is true, he said, stepping forward though his voice shook. About the shaft. I was there. I helped carry the man out. Crane's foreman told us to say it was a rockfall, told us we would lose our jobs and our debt would be called due if we said different, and half of us owe that store more than we will earn in 5 years. But I am tired of being afraid, Senora. I will tell a judge what I saw if someone will make sure my family does not starve for it. They will not starve, Nora said at once. You have my word and the word of every family in Alma Crossing. Crane's face had gone thin and pale with fury, but with a yard full of witnesses now, and his own foreman's hand not yet on a drawn gun, he seemed to calculate correctly that this was not the ground on which to force a killing. Release the wagons, he said at last to Whitfield, biting off each word. All of them. I will not have it said Silas Crane starved women and children, but this is not finished, Mrs. Bristol. I still hold the water rights on Cobber Ridge, and I will find another way to make Alma Crossing see reason. He turned on his heel and climbed back into his private car without another word, and Bragg, after a long, hard look at Stephen that promised a reckoning yet to come, followed him. The wagons began, at last, to roll south. But that night, as Nora and Stephen made camp a mile outside Two Forks with Pedro Ibarra riding along to give his testimony in Alma Crossing, a rider came pounding up the road from the direction of the mine, lathered and wild-eyed, shouting for anyone to hear that Bragg had loosed an ore train down the Cobber Ridge grade with its brakes lashed open, aimed for the freight yard at Alma Crossing, where, this very evening, the whole town would be gathered at the depot platform to receive the long-overdue supply wagons. Stephen was on his feet and moving before the rider had finished speaking. How long ago? 20 minutes, maybe less. It will reach the grade above the town inside the hour." "That is not enough time to ride ahead and warn them," Nora said, already running for the wagon, her mind working through the geography of home with cold, clear urgency. "But it might be enough time to reach the switch at the old stone quarry spur before the train does, if we cut across dry wash instead of following the rail grade around. You know that switch? I forged the new throw lever for it myself 2 winters back, when the old one froze solid," Nora said, already climbing up beside him rather than into her own wagon, trusting his horse's speed over her mule's. "It has not been used in years, but it still runs, if someone can reach it and pull it in time." They rode hard through the gathering dusk, Pedro Ibarra thundering behind them on the teamster's spare horse, cutting cross-country over ground that jolted teeth and rattled bones, guided in the last stretch by a young Tohono Wadem rider named Tomás Javier, who had been watering horses near dry wash and fell in beside them without being asked the moment he understood what was happening, knowing a shortcut through the wash that shaved a crucial half-mile from their route. "The old quarry spur comes off the main grade a quarter-mile above the depot," Tomás shouted over the wind of their passage. "There is a rise there. You will hear the train before you see it." They heard it long before they reached the switch, a low grinding roar building out of the dark behind the ridge, the shriek of overheated iron on iron growing louder with terrible speed. Alma Crossing's depot lights glimmered below in the valley, and Nora could just make out, with a lurch of pure horror, the dark cluster of townsfolk gathered on the platform, waiting for supply wagons they had no idea were about to be answered by 300 tons of runaway ore cars instead. "There is no time to reach the platform and clear them," Stephen said, reading the same terrible arithmetic she was. "I am going to try to get aboard and work the brake by hand. You get to that switch." "Stephen, I have jumped a moving train before, Nora. Not for a reason I am proud of, but I know how it is done. Go." There was no time to argue, no time even for the words crowding her throat. She reached out and gripped his hand once hard, and he gripped back, and then he was spurring his horse alongside the rail grade where it curved down out of the dark, matching pace with the thundering cars as they came screaming past, and Nora wheeled away toward the quarry switch with Tomás and Pedro close behind, her heart hammering louder, it seemed, than the runaway train itself. Stephen brought his horse in tight alongside the lead ore car, close enough to feel the heat of overheated axles, and at the last possible moment, he kicked free of the stirrups and threw himself across the gap onto the car's iron ladder, fingers finding a rung and holding through a jolt that nearly tore his arms from their sockets. He hauled himself up and along the car tops in the shrieking dark, the wind trying to pluck him off with every lurch, until he reached the brake wheel at the rear platform and threw his whole weight against it. It was rusted, stubborn, screaming its own protest, and it gave only grudgingly, slowing the wild plunge by degrees rather than all at once, sparks showering from the wheels below as the brake shoes bit at last into overheated iron. Below, Nora reached the quarry switch at a dead run, threw herself from the wagon before it had fully stopped, and seized the lever she herself had forged 2 winters before. It was stiff with disuse, and for one heart-stopping moment it would not move at all, and she heard the train bearing down, closer now, close enough that she could see sparks flying gold against the black ridge above. "Together!" Tomás shouted, throwing his weight against the lever beside her, and Pedro added his own strength a heartbeat later, and the three of them heaved as one until the frozen mechanism gave with a shriek of its own, the rails shifting, the switch throwing over just as the slowed but still fast-moving train reached the junction and rumbled, groaning, off the main grade and onto the disused quarry spur that dead-ended safely in a great man-made bank of loose gravel a quarter-mile beyond. Built up over years of quarry waste for exactly no reason anyone had ever imagined until this night. The lead cars struck the gravel bank in a grinding, shuddering crash that Nora felt through the soles of her boots even from where she stood, but it was the crash of a controlled stop, not a catastrophe. Iron and timber crumpling into an embankment rather than into a platform crowded with the people of Alma Crossing. Dust and steam rolled up into the dark. For a long, terrible moment there was no sound at all beyond the settling groan of metal, and Nora's heart seized around a single unbearable thought: Stephen, before she was running, stumbling over gravel and broken rail ties toward the wreck. Stephen, her voice cracked on it. Stephen Walker, answer me. Here. The word came ragged from somewhere near the rear of the stalled cars, and she found him half slid down from the last car's platform, one arm hanging wrong at the shoulder, a gash across his brow bleeding freely into his eye, but alive, breathing alive. She reached him and he half fell into her arms, and she held him up with a strength she had not known she had, laughing and weeping at once in the way a person does when terror breaks all at once into relief. "You absolute fool," she said into his shoulder. "You could have been killed." "I very nearly was," he admitted, voice hoarse, "and I would do it again every time if the other choice was letting that train reach your town." Down in the valley, the lights of the depot platform had already begun moving toward them, lanterns bobbing as the men of Alma Crossing, alerted by the crash and the shouting, came running to see what had happened and found, instead of tragedy, a wrecked ore train stopped a quarter-mile short of the people it had been sent to kill, and a widow and an outlaw-turned-honest man standing amid the wreckage, holding each other up in the settling dust. The town gathered around them within minutes, Hartman first, rifle forgotten in his hand, then Doña Refugio pushing through to see to Stephen's shoulder and the gash on his brow, then a dozen others, faces lit gold by lantern light, all of them talking at once, demanding to know what had happened. And slowly in pieces between Nora and Stephen and Pedro and Tomás, the whole of it came out: Crane's scheme, the poisoned mine, the debt-bound workers, Bragg's murderous order, and the desperate ride that had stopped it. It was Hartman, in the end, who put into words what every face in that circle of lantern light was already showing. "Crane meant to kill half this town tonight to punish us for saying no to him," he said, low and furious. "That is past bearing. That is past any water rights or supply wagons. We ride on Cobber Ridge at first light, every man who can carry a rifle, and we see this settled." "No," Nora said, and something in her voice, forge-tempered and cert, cut through the rising anger like cold water. "Not with rifles. That is exactly what Crane wants, an excuse to call in territorial troops against an armed mob, and to bury his crimes under a story about lawless border ruffians. We do this the way we stopped his train, with proof and witnesses and the truth laid out where no one can look away from it." She looked to Pedro Ibarra, who nodded, steady now despite his exhaustion. "I will tell what I saw," he said. "Others will too, now that Bragg's crime cannot be hidden as an accident. Enough of us are tired of being afraid." It took 3 more days to see it properly done, 3 days in which Stephen, his arm bound in a sling and the gash on his brow stitched by Doña Refugio's careful hand, dictated a full account of Crane's falsified inspections from memory to Nora, who wrote it out in her clear librarian's hand and made 3 copies, one for the reconnected telegraph line to carry to the territorial marshal's office in Tucson the moment repair crews restored it, one for the newspaper editor at the county seat, and one kept safe in Nora's own strongbox against any attempt to make the matter disappear. Pedro Ibarra's sworn statement went with it, along with 2 other mine workers who found their courage once the first had spoken, and Whitfield, the depot agent, shamed and frightened in equal measure, added his own account of the orders he had been given to hold Alma Crossing supplies. The marshal arrived from Tucson 8 days later with 2 deputies, and a stern, tired-eyed manner that suggested he had dealt with mining company troubles before and expected to deal with more before he was through. He listened to the accounts, examined the wreck at the quarry spur himself, and rode up to Cobber Ridge to arrest Bragg on the spot, the foreman offering no resistance once he understood how thoroughly his crime had been documented. Silas Crane proved harder to catch. He had already fled east on the first train out of Two Forks the morning after the wreck, and it would be months yet. Word eventually reached Alma Crossing, before territorial authorities in Prescott finally caught up with him, and the mining company's board, faced with a scandal too large to bury, forced him out and installed new management that settled the water dispute fairly and forgave the crushing company store debts that had trapped so many families at the mine. But that ending, though it mattered enormously to the town, unfolded slowly and mostly at a distance, in telegraph reports and newspaper columns that reached Alma Crossing weeks after the fact. The ending that mattered most to Nora Bristol and Stephen Walker happened much closer to home, in the days and weeks immediately following the wreck, while the town began, in earnest, to rebuild what 3 weeks of starvation and one terrible night of danger had strained near to breaking. Nora threw herself into the forge with a fierce, focused energy the whole town soon came to depend on. With the supply wagons finally rolling regularly again, there was still a season's worth of neglected repairs to catch up on plowshares gone dull and cracked from families forced to work poor tools rather than spend scarce cash, wagon wheels that had gone unrepaired, well-digging tools needed by 3 families determined never again to depend on water they could not trust, even a new set of fittings for the schoolhouse well pump. Stephen, his shoulder healing and his arm finally free of its sling, became her steady second at the forge, learning the trade with the same quiet diligence he had brought to every hard thing in his life since Val Verde County, and the two of them fell into an easy rhythm of work that neither had known with anyone else, her calling out measurements, him working the bellows and holding steady what needed holding, both of them comfortable in the companionable silence of shared purpose, broken by easy laughter more often than either had expected. It was in the midst of this that Nora, sorting through the returned books in her library satchel one evening, found the folded scrap of paper tucked in the pages of the poetry book Stephen had borrowed weeks before, forgotten there since the night of the windstorm at the Delgado Rancho. She unfolded it by lamplight and read the few lines in his careful clerk's hand. "I do not know how a man says thank you for being looked at like he is not ruined," and sat very still for a long moment, her heart doing something complicated and warm in her chest. She found him at the forge the next morning, banking the coals for the day's work, and held the paper out without preamble. "You left this in my book," she said. Color rose in his face, plain even against his sun-browned skin. "I meant to take it back before you found it. I am glad you did not manage it." She stepped closer, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. "I have been carrying my own words around unsaid for weeks now, Stephen Walker, thinking there was no proper time to say them, with Crane and the mine and the whole town's troubles pressing in on us. But I do not think there is ever going to be a perfectly proper time in this life, and I find I am tired of waiting for one." She took a breath. "I love you. I have loved you, I think, since a windstorm and a rooftop, or perhaps since before that, since a bloodied stranger opened his eyes in my own bed and looked at me as though I were the only steady thing in a spinning world. I do not want to go on not saying it." Stephen set down the fire iron with hands that were not quite steady. "Nora Bristol," he said, and his voice had gone rough, "I have loved you since you told a train robber and a mine tyrant both, in the same week, exactly what you thought of them without so much as a tremor in your voice. I have written you a dozen letters I never had the courage to give you, because I could not believe a woman like you would want a man with my history, however honest I have tried to make the years since." He reached out and took her hand, the same hand she had once pressed hard against his bleeding side to keep him alive. "But I am done being afraid of my own past standing between us. If you will have me, I would like very much to spend the rest of my life being the man you already believe I am." "I will have you," Nora said, and there was no hesitation in it at all, gladly, and soon, "if the town will forgive us for not waiting on a long engagement." The town, as it turned out, was more than willing to forgive them, and more than eager to celebrate. Alma Crossing had spent a hard, frightened month watching its stores dwindle and its future hang on the whims of a corrupt and distant power, and had come through it whole, its water rights secured, its wagons rolling, its people fed, and the story of how that had happened, of a blacksmith's widow and a reformed outlaw who had ridden a wild journey across storm-battered country and stopped a runaway train with their own hands, was not one the town meant to let pass without proper marking. The wedding took place on a mild Saturday 3 weeks later, in the yard behind Hartman's store, since it was the only space in Alma Crossing large enough to hold everyone who wanted to come. And nearly everyone did come. Rosa Delgado and her family rode in from their rancho with baskets of tamales, and a length of fine lace Rosa insisted on sewing into Nora's dress herself, declaring that any woman who had helped nail down her roof in a windstorm deserved better than store-bought trim. Tomás Javier arrived with several families from Presidio de la Cruz, bringing woven baskets and strings of dried chilies as gifts, and stood near the front through the ceremony with the quiet, watchful pride of a man who had helped throw a switch lever in the dark and knew exactly what it had bought. Pedro Ibarra came down from Cobber Ridge with his wife and children, all of them dressed in their best, the debt that had once bound him to the company store forgiven at last under the mine's new management, his testimony remembered now not as a dangerous risk, but as the brave act that had helped set things right. Doña Refugio, who had nursed Stephen through his fever and stitched the gash above his eye after the wreck, stood beside Doc Pierce near the makeshift altar of wildflowers and mesquite branches that the town's children had gathered that morning. Ezekiel Hartman, looking uncharacteristically emotional for a man who had spent 30 years running a dry goods store with a poker face, stood ready to give Nora away in the absence of any living family of her own, since Thomas's people were long gone, and her own kin lived farther east than any letter of hers had ever reached. Nora wore her mother's silver locket, the only piece of jewelry she owned that had survived the long journey west, and a simple dress of pale blue cotton trimmed with Rosa's careful lace, her dark hair pinned up but for one loose curl that the wind, gentle for once, kept teasing free. Stephen wore a borrowed coat that fit him perfectly across shoulders grown broader from months at the forge, his gray eyes fixed on her the entire slow walk across the yard, as though he could not quite believe she was real. The circuit preacher, who happened by good fortune to be passing through on his regular route just that week, kept the ceremony simple, as befit a border town more accustomed to hard work than fine ceremony. But there was nothing simple about the way Stephen's voice shook, just slightly, when he spoke his vows, or the way Nora's hand tightened in his as though she meant never to let it go again. "I, Stephen Walker," he said, "take you, Nora Bristol, to stand beside me through whatever storms come, the ones that threaten roofs and the ones that threaten hearts, and I promise you the whole of the man I have worked so hard to become, for as long as I live." "I, Nora Bristol," she answered, "take you, Stephen Walker, knowing full well who you were and loving still more fiercely who you are, and I promise you a forge that will always be warm for you, and a home that will always be yours, and a heart that has already chosen you above any fear of choosing wrong." When the preacher pronounced them married, the whole yard erupted into cheering that startled the mules tied at the rail, and sent a flock of doves scattering up off the store roof into the clear afternoon sky. And Stephen kissed his bride to a chorus of whoops and applause that echoed clean across the little border town that had, against every effort to starve it into submission, found itself instead full to bursting with food and friends, and a joy hard-won enough to be savored all the more for the trouble it had taken to reach. The celebration ran long into the evening, with fiddle music from a Delgado cousin and guitar from one of Tomás's people blending into something neither wholly American, nor wholly Mexican, nor wholly anything but Alma Crossing's own, and dancing that spilled out from Hartman's yard into the street itself, under lanterns strung between the buildings. Nora danced with nearly every man in town, as tradition and courtesy demanded, but it was to Stephen's arms she returned again and again through the long, happy night. And when at last the celebration began to wind down and the older children had fallen asleep against their parents' shoulders, the two of them slipped away together toward the smithy that was now, in every sense that mattered, their shared home. They stood a while in the yard behind it, looking up at a sky gone thick with stars, the forge cold and banked for the night behind them, the whole town settling into a peace it had not known in months. "I keep thinking," Nora said softly, leaning into his shoulder, "of everything that had to happen to bring us here. A wounded man riding into a street he had never seen before, a storm that could have blown either of us clean off that roof, a train that could have killed us both 100 different ways before it ever reached that gravel bank." "I have thought the same," Stephen admitted, wrapping an arm around her. "I have thought more than once how strange it is that the worst month of my life turned out to be the one that gave me everything I have now. I do not regret a moment of the danger, Nora, not truly, because every hard mile of it led me to you." "Then I suppose," she said, tilting her face up to his, "we ought to be grateful to Silas Crane, though I expect he would be furious to hear it." Stephen laughed, low and warm, and kissed her again beneath the wide desert sky. And somewhere behind them the forge sat cold and quiet for the one night in many weeks that no one needed it lit. A settlement saved, a debt-bound workforce freed, a corrupt man's schemes laid bare and broken, and a blacksmith's widow and a reformed outlaw standing together at last, no longer strangers thrown together by danger, but partners bound by choice, ready to face together whatever winds the years ahead might bring. In the months that followed, life in Alma Crossing settled into a new and sturdier rhythm. The railroad, under management chastened by scandal and by a territorial marshal who kept a watchful eye on the Cobber Ridge line thereafter, ran its freight fairly and on schedule, and the water rights agreement that Crane had tried to steal by starvation was instead settled by honest negotiation, giving the town secure claim to the Santa Rosa Creek for a generation to come. Pedro Ibarra and the other mine families, freed from the company store's crushing debt, began at last to put a little money by, and more than one of them found their way to Nora's forge for tools to start small gardens and workshops of their own, trading skills and goods across the old routes that had always bound the borderland together, American and Mexican and Wadam alike, routes that no single greedy man's railroad had ever truly owned. Nora kept her library route, though she ran it now with a lighter heart, and more often than not, her husband riding beside her, the two of them delivering books and letters and news across 50 miles of hard, beautiful country that had very nearly cost them everything, and had instead given them each other. And in the smithy behind their home, the forge burned bright and steady most every evening, hammer ringing against iron in a rhythm that had once been a widow's lonely grief, and had become, in time, the sound of two lives joined, building something new and lasting out of whatever the hard world sent their way.